All right, the session will come to order. If anyone needs an introduction to the next presenter, I suggest you see him after the meeting. We're delighted to have Lyndon LaRouche.
Right. Just for the record, I state a few facts which bear upon the circumstances in which certain events befell me. I was born in September 1922 in Rochester, New Hampshire, lived there for the first 10 years of my life, lived for the next 22 years of my life in Lynn, Massachusetts, except for service overseas. I moved to New York City, where I lived until July of 1983. And since that time, except for a period of incarceration, I have been a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I attended university a couple of times during the course before the war, or at the beginning of the war and after it, and then had a career in management consulting, which lasted until about 1972, tapered off, sort of. My most notable professional achievement was developed during the years 1948, 1952, in certain discoveries of a fundamental scientific nature in respect to economics. And my professional qualifications are essentially derived from that. In the course of time, in 1964 approximately, I was persuaded that things were being done to change the United States, which, from my view, were the worst possible disaster which could befall this nation. And thus, while I had given up any hope of political improvement of this country before then to speak of, I felt I had to do something. So I became involved part-time from 1966 through 1973 in teaching a course, a one-semester course in economics, largely on the graduate level at a number of campus locations, chiefly in New York City, but also in Pennsylvania. In the course of this, a number of the students who participated in these classes became associated with me. And out of this association came the birth of a nascent political organization, as much a philosophical organization as political. Our essential commitment was third world issues and related issues. That is, that the economic justice for what is called the third world is essential for a just society for all nations. I became particularly attached to this during military service overseas in India, where I saw what colonialism does to people. And I was persuaded at the time, as I believe a majority of the people who were in service with me, was that we were coming to the end of a war which we had not foreseen, for which we had been obliged to fight, and that if we allowed these circumstances to prevail that I saw in the third world, we would bring upon ourselves some kind of disaster, either war or something comparable down the line. And that was essentially our commitment as an association. We became rather unpopular with a number of institutions, including McGeorge Bundy's Ford Foundation. About 1969, we made a mess of a few projects he was funding by exposing them. And we also became unpopular with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, perhaps on the behest of McGeorge Bundy. In 1973, there was, according to a document later issued under the Freedom of Information Act by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting at all times under supervision of Washington headquarters, hatched a plot to have me eliminated or to induce the Communist Party USA that my elimination would solve a number of their problems. There actually was an abortive attempt on me during that period. And later, of course, I knew the FBI had been involved. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew it. And later, a document appeared showing that. From that point on, during the 1970s, until the end of COINTELPRO, we were constantly beset by the FBI. Our main weapon against the FBI was jokes. We used to make some jokes about the FBI, which we would pass around to try to persuade them to keep off our tail, but they kept coming, and all kinds of harassment. Then, at 1982, there was a new development. I sensed it happening, but I received the documents later. The events which led to my what I would call a fraudulently obtained indictment and conviction and incarceration. It started, according to the record, of which I had some sensibility this was going on at the time, of Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, with whom no love was lost between us, went to William Webster and others soliciting an FBI or other government operation against me and my associates. This led, as the record later showed, to a decision by Henry Kissinger's friends on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board recommending an operation against me and my associates. This was adopted during the same month of January by Judge Webster, the director of the FBI, who passed the implementation of this instruction along to his subordinate, Oliver Buck Revell, recently retired from the FBI, I believe. And the first inkling I had of this was in about April of 1983, at which time a New York banker, who is very intelligence-witting, shall we say, a private bank of Smith and Train in New York City, held a salon at which various government agents, private individuals, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, and also NBC TV News, the Reader's Digest, the Wall Street Journal, and others were represented. The purpose was to coordinate an array of libels, a menu of libels, which would be commonly used by the news media in an attempt to defame me and hopefully, from their standpoint, to lead to criminal action against me and my associates. In January of 1984, this attack came into the open, launched by NBC TV, which had been a participant in this salon of trains, which launched the pattern, which was the pattern of coverage by all U.S. news media, major news media, and many minor news media, from the period of January, the end of January 1984, through the end of 1988. I saw no case of any significant coverage of me or mention of me in the U.S. print media, particularly the major print media, the Associated Press in particular, which was an active part of the prosecution, in fact, or in the national television media, network media especially. Not a single mention of me which did not conform to the menu of libels concocted by this salon, which had been established under John Train as part of this operation. This salon, including the Anti-Defamation League, NBC, TV, others, the Associated Press, actively collaborated, beginning sometime in 1984, with forces inside the government which were determined to have a criminal prosecution against me and my associates. The criminal prosecution was launched in about the time of the election, the 1984 presidential election, in October, November 1984. And from that point on, it was a continued escalation until a federal case in Boston led to a mistrial, occasioned largely by government misconduct in the case, in May of 1988. Following that, in about October, was it 14th or something of that sort, in Virginia, a new prosecution was opened up, and that led to my conviction in December of 1988 and my sentencing for 15 years in 1989. I believe Mr. Anderson has described the nature of the case. And that resulted in 5 years of service in federal prison, of which I'm now released on parole. The motivations of the case against us, I think, are in part obvious, perhaps partly not. In 1982-83, there were two things which greatly excited my enemies. Number one, I had been involved in 1982 in presenting a proposal which is based on my forecast in the spring of 1982 that a major debt crisis would break out in South America, Central America, and the expectation that Mexico would be the nation that would have a debt crisis. I've been involved with many of these countries and personalities in them in projecting alternatives to this kind of inequitable system where colonial nation had been replaced as a term by debtor nation. And the debt of South America, Central America was largely illegitimate, that it was a debt which had not been incurred for value received, but had been done under special monetary conditions under the so-called floating exchange rate system, where somebody would come, bankers would come to a country, the IMF in particular, and say, we just wrote down the value of the currency, we're now going to refund your financing of your foreign debt, which you can no longer pay on the same basis as before. So I propose that the debt crisis be used as the occasion for united action by a number of governments of South and Central American countries to force a reform in the international debt relations and to force a reform within international monetary relations. This report was entitled Operation Juarez, largely because of the relationship of President Lincoln to Mexico during the time that Lincoln was president, with the idea that it was in the interest of the United States to accept and to sponsor such a reform, to assist these countries in the freedom to resume development of the type which they had desired. And this report was published in August of 1982, ironically a few weeks before the eruption of the great Mexico debt crisis of '82, and was presented also to the U.S. government, the National Security Council, for the President's information at that time. There was some effort on the part of the President of Mexico to implement my proposal in the initial period of the debt crisis. He had at that time some support from the President of Brazil and the government of Argentina. But under pressure from the United States, the government of Brazil and Argentina capitulated, and President Jose Lopez Portillo, the President of Mexico, was left, shall we say, hanging out to dry. As a result, in October of 1982, he capitulated to the terms which were delivered to his government and people around him by people such as Henry A. Kissinger, who made a trip to Mexico at that time to attempt to intimidate the Mexicans to submitting to these new terms. This was one issue between me and Kissinger and his friends. The second issue was that sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted, according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1982 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with on the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense, which I had this proposal which the President adopted, at least initially, in the form of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by the President on March 23rd, 1983, there were a lot of people out for my scalp. Those are the at least contributing factors in what happened to me. But they may not be all. There probably are others as well. What I find significant, and I found significant in this case, is that The problem here, even though Kissinger may have been largely the author or the agent of the authors in bringing about the what I would characterize as a fraudulent indictment and conviction, that the problem here is that, and I saw this from being in prison, where people would come to me with their paperwork and talk to me about their cases, prisoners, which it made a stronger impression on me on this question, that we have, in my view, a system of injustice whose center is within the Department of Justice, especially the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The problem lies not with one administration or another, though one administration or another may act more positively or more negatively. You have permanent civil service employees, like Deputy Assistant Attorneys General Jack Keeney and Mark Richard, who are coordinators of a nest of institutions in the criminal division, which show up repeatedly as leading or key associates of every legal atrocity which I've seen. This is the case with the so-called Frumention operation, which is largely an FBI operation, but cannot run without cooperation from these people and their assistants. The case of the demoniac case, which is outstanding, of a man who they, according to the Sixth Circuit, a man who the Justice Department knew to be innocent of the charges they were making against him at the time they made the charges. And yet Mark Richard and Jack Keeney and so forth proceeded with that case and attempted to secure the execution of this man in Israel over the objections of the Israeli government for an OSI operation which was set into place by Henry Kissinger some years before. You have the case of the Weaver case, the same thing. The much celebrated case of the Waco case, the same complex of injustice. We have an out-of-control Justice Department, in my view, where the rot is not in the appointees as much as it is in the permanent bureaucracy. We have a permanent sickness in the permanent bureaucracy of part of our government. In my case, when the time came that somebody wanted me out of the way, they were able to rely upon that permanent injustice in the permanent bureaucracy of government to do the job. As in the Frumention case, the Weaver case, the Waco case, the case of Waldheim, the case of Demoniac, in other cases, always there's that agency inside the Justice Department which works for contract like a hitman when somebody with the right credentials and passwords walks in and says, we want to get this group of people or we want to get this person. My case may be, as Ramsey Clark described it, the most extensive and the highest level of these cases in terms of the duration and scope of the operation, which came to involve the Soviet government. It came to involve the East German Stasi intelligence service. It involves collaboration between the Department of Justice and the Stasi in the case of Palmer's murder case. It involved direct collaboration between, as I say, the Soviet government, the Soviet press, particularly from about off and on Andropov beginning the 1984. And then when Gorbachev came in again, 85 to 86 into 88, the Soviet press vilification of me in collaboration with the same line as the US press exceeded that of anything since Stalin's time in the Soviet press against any private individual in history. And it was part of the same operation. So my case is important in the sense it's more extensive, it's more deep-going, long-going. But when it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it. My general impression from being in prison and meeting these fellows, and I know these fellows, you know, you get in prison and you get my experience, you know the people you're with. Well, they're all perpetrators, most of them. A few cases are really innocent, framed up. But most of them were drug cases or something else, and you knew they were in the group of people they accused of being a group in. But when I saw the paperwork, I was astonished. I saw totally counterproductive sentences. I saw a shameful proceeding that our federal court system, our federal criminal justice system is out of control. And it appears to me that this nest around Mark Richard and Jack Keeney and others in the permanent bureaucracy of the Justice Department, if they're not the heart of the problem, they're close enough to it that if you pull out that cancer, you may find out where the next one is. That's my view of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything you ask me, of course.
Anyone?
No, go ahead. How would you propose to deal with a permanent bureaucracy that's protected by civil service laws, cowardly politicians, and people with power? How do you get at that?
I think it can be done. I'm not pessimistic, though I'm very cautious about this. It's very dangerous. In my view, we're living in very dangerous times. In my view, the global monetary and financial system as it now exists is going to collapse. The only thing that can prevent a collapse is government action to put it through the equivalent of what we call Chapter 11 bankruptcy. These are dangerous times. We see what in the Congress, for example, the contract on America or with America. This is the kind of stuff of which Nazi concentration camps are made, death camps are made. You declare some people unwed mothers, useless eaters, or their children. You take people who are in categories such as senior citizens. And we saw in Chicago with people dying in a heat wave because of a breakdown in the infrastructure. There was no electricity to run their air conditioning. And people of hypothermia dying because as you get more advanced years, your resistance, except for some tough ladies I met in Alabama of 100 years of age, but you become weakened and you die. If you withhold necessary medical care, you die. If you withhold, you say, well, that medical procedure, that test is very good, but we think it's not cost-benefit wise. And therefore, someone dies of cancer because of the precautionary test, say, for prostate cancer. And I've seen some cases of this recently in my personal periphery. The relevant test was not made because some physician who had been brainwashed by our present policy said, in cost-benefit terms, that procedure is available. We don't think it's wise. It jacks up the insurance rates if too many people use it. And yet that test is essential to have someone act on a prostate cancer sometimes between the time of its onset and the time it becomes virtually uncontrollable. So if we remove tests, if we remove adequate medical care, if we remove public assistance for people who are desperate, we have, in a sense, with a pencil, done the same thing as if we killed the same number of people with an axe. We are in times, as typified by the rate of incarceration per 100,000 in our prison system. And you begin to look at the social composition of that incarceration and look at the effect of that on communities. We are coming in very hard and vicious times in which it is very embarrassing to speak of Nazi Germany for comparison. There are too many cases in our own country which are moving in that direction in terms of our public morality. But I also see in countries like Russia. Russia has been turned into a third world country by the economic policies which Margaret Thatcher and George Bush dictated to those countries in Eastern Europe. Russia is a country which has not been conquered since the time of the Tatar occupation over 500 years ago. And they're becoming very angry. The world is ready to blow up. War is spreading around this planet, or conditions tantamount to war. We're coming into a time in which impossible decisions are going to have to be made. The monetary system is going to go under. There's nothing can stop it, unless presidential action acts to create a new monetary system. So at this time, the politics of Gingrich, the politics of Phil Gramm and the other death penalty and mass murder advocates, which is what they really are. Because if you kill somebody by a stroke of a pencil as a bureaucrat on a piece of paper, you might as well have killed them with an axe. Killing them with an axe would be more honest. And we're doing that. I think these people can be defeated. And I think that if we stand up on our hind legs and fight, the change will come. In my experience in politics, if you want to organize a meeting of one person, you have to contact 100 people, canvass 100 people. If you want a meeting of 100 people, you have to canvass 10,000. Now, in that 10,000, you'll find usually one person. If you get a meeting of 100, you're going to find at least one person in that 100 who is a self-starter, who is a natural leader, no matter what their educational level is. They tend to think, they tend to be active, they tend to be leaders. I think that if people who are leaders, who have manifested themselves as leaders, by emerging as leaders in the political process, in other parts of life, stand up in a united way and present an alternative at this time, not as individuals, because you have to bring people together to get force. But I think we can inspire people on these times of crisis, when the monetary system is coming down, when people say government must do something. I think we can change government. I think the 1996 election campaign process is a process in which we have a chance, if we speak appropriately into the right fora, that united groups of people who point out that these concerns are not just a concern of some so-called interest group, but they're the proper concern of every citizen of a conscience, that 80% of us in this country at least will all be victims, not just one group. And if we can unite around principles, moral principles and principles of justice, I think we can make a dent in the situation. And I think we'd be remiss and criminally remiss in the deepest sense if we didn't try. So I can't guarantee anything. I never look for guarantees, but I think we got a chance of winning.
I raised that to you, you know, you and I had a little chat in Selma, Alabama, and you were saying to me that, well, I had raised to you about affirmative action. And I think your phrase was that it was a red herring. And I didn't get a chance to say to you that it is a red herring, but whole states are buying it. And for a little black fella sitting off 20% of the population, this government has not been in touch with me since Lyndon Johnson said he wouldn't run again, and I had a lot of reservations about him. But sitting back as a little black fella, and I see entire states marching in lockstep and accepting this red herring as gospel, I guess you can understand that even somebody like me sometimes feel overwhelmed, and whether or not America is just a lost cause. I hate to sound that way, but after 40 years, I got serious reservations about whether we can save this country, about whether this country even wants to be saved.
Well, I take an evangelical view of this. I've been associated with many lost causes in my life, as you have.
Yeah.
And once in a while we win them. The point is, government, we're coming to a time, look at what's happened in France, as an example. We had a Gingrich type who just got fired. He got resigned. That is, his prime minister told him he'd accept his resignation pronto, by the name of Madeleine. Madeleine is the translator into French of the works of Friedrich von Hayek. Friedrich von Hayek was a British agent of Austrian origin who was the founder of the Mont Pelerin Society. And if you want to know everything that's right-wing and extremely right-wing in economics in the United States, you can generally trace it to the Mont Pelerin Society. But Madeleine was fired, and the Prime Minister of France, Juppé, made a public statement explaining the resignation, or the induced resignation, or forced resignation of Juppé, of Madeleine. He said, this country, France, has a commitment to ensure that there are enough jobs for the people of France. And Madeleine was on the other program, and he had to go. Now, We've had an experience in this country with Roosevelt, who shouldn't be exaggerated, Franklin Roosevelt, that is. But nonetheless, we had an experience which is very important for us, is that it is the function of the federal government in particular, through its public works program, its infrastructure responsibility under our Constitution, implicitly, and through the ability to generate credit, as we did with space programs, and we did with wartime buildup for war, to use the public credit to create enough jobs to get the job done. I saw Alabama. That's what the problem is there, not enough jobs. And the federal government, this country, under an economic crisis, can do what Roosevelt did and better, because we can learn from the experience. Our job is not affirmative action to share out the shrinking number of jobs available. Our job is to create the jobs and to create at the same time the matching educational facilities and the support programs which turn the unemployed, who are not taxpayers because they don't have any income to be part of the tax revenue base, to become a contributing member of society and a part of the tax revenue base. And there's nothing that stops us except crazy ideology from following our Constitution and its original intent and doing just that, as Lincoln did. We can do it again. There's no need for somebody begging out in the street to get somebody else's job. There's a lot of work to be done. You just look at the Tom Bigby project and what should have been done to complete that. That'll keep people busy for a long time. You take the American water system. Our aquifers are turning into sewers when they're not going dry because we're not building a water project, which we need. We don't have enough power. We have 20%. When we came out of World War II, there were 60% of us in the labor force were producing material goods. Today, less than 20%. We have coupon clippers, we have unemployed, we have people in prison, but 20% are producing. Our standard of living in the United States today, in physical terms, if you include healthcare, education, science and technology, plus the things you physically consume, we're half of what we were 25 years ago. We're about that in productivity. This nation is going down the sewer. The world's going down the sewer. We have the means, and government has the means, to turn it around. When enough people in this country stand up on their hind legs and stop voting for what they don't want, or for a result they don't want. And I think that if the problem with people, as I see it, is people don't trust the leadership, and I don't blame them for not trusting their leadership. I blame them for being too pessimistic. And it's up to us and others to get enough people moving to create a movement. Like the case just of Martin Luther King. Now, I never personally met Martin Luther King, but I watched him closely. And I know something about Martin Luther King from people who knew him and his circumstances. And here's a man who's a good man, he's a preacher, Baptist preacher, I don't know, they run to this way and that way. But one day somebody appointed him, nominated him to be a leader of the civil rights movement, out of a crowd, so to speak. He took the job as an appointee, like a federal appointee, only this was the civil rights movement. He went from crisis to crisis in a few years from the time that he received that appointment until he went to his death, knowing he was facing death. And in that period of time, he made a number of public speeches of great power and pith. Each of those speeches corresponded to a point of crisis in the history of the civil rights movement. And I saw on television, and I read in the recorded speeches, I read a man who had gone into his own Gethsemane, probably inspired by reading the New Testament, and said, I will drink of this cup. And he came out with an idea, with a lot of people swarming around him. But he came out with the idea, and he presented a concept which took a whole people who were looking to him in the civil rights movement, and he ennobled them. He said, you're not fighting for African-American rights, you're fighting for everybody's rights. You're fighting to make the Constitution real. And it was a new idea, a different idea. And as he did with his mountain speech that he gave just before he went, Again, a man who had walked into Gethsemane and said, "Yes, Lord, I will drink of this cup as my Savior before me." And he went out and he drank of the cup, and he inspired people. Now, we don't know who among us is going to be the great leader of this period. But we know, as the civil rights people of the 1960s who had been at the civil rights business for many centuries, in point of fact, many of them of the conscious family tradition, they assembled together. They picked people from their midst as leaders. And among these leaders was a Martin Luther King. And I think if enough of us assemble today around these kinds of issues and show the nation that there is something moving, something which is of concern to the average citizen, that from among those we gather, together for that purpose, we will find the leaders we need.
Mr. LaRouche, these hearings should be about 20 minutes away from here. The building down here, in the Congressional hearing room or Senate hearing room. And I understand that at one time it was scheduled for that. The public doesn't know that this is going on. Like I said, a lot of our colleagues and a lot of our people don't know that this is going on. And they're not going to know it's going on unless we get the word out. Now, how do we get the word out, and how do we get this meeting moved from here 20 minutes away?
Well, I would, first of all, some of you know what the underhouse of the Congress is. It has complications, particularly right now. In terms of moving people around the country, I think we can do it. I've been thinking about this quite seriously in terms of the implementation. My wife, of course, Helga was more, together with our associate, was more on top of the planning, but I was concerned with the communications aspect of what came out of this. My concern was to have a recorded proceeding which could be shown in two forms. First of all, a permanent record, as we would in, say, a court proceeding, so we can use video for a permanent record of the proceedings. That should be available to people of concern, lawyers and others around the country. We can also have, I think, a number of 1 hour or so forth video presentations of highlights of the evidence, of highlights of the deliberations by the committee panel itself. I think this can be an organizing tool if people just take it around the country, produce copies of this. We'll take it every boondock we know. We have chapter meetings going on of our association weekly, and they'll all see this, and they'll be encouraged to spread it around. I think there are places on some TV that will be interested in some of this sort of thing, and it can be shown. I think that we find that when you tap these resources that we're trying to bring together around this, that a lot of people have resources, and they can spread it. I do not believe that this country belongs to the Gingriches and Grahams or Wilsons. Wilson's just an interchangeable part. He could become anything you want him to be. Right? Mirror, mirror on the wall, who am I today? We know that type of politician. But the Grahams, I think, are sort of something, a catfish would move into the next stream if some bottom feeder like that moved into their habitat. But I don't think that the country belongs to these people. I don't think we ought to be afraid of them. Less than 25%, as Senator Kennedy pointed out in January of 1995, less than 25% of the voters in this country actually voted for these people, who are now the majority, because 50% didn't vote. I think if there's enough morale going and people have a reason to turn out to vote, or turn out to organize around the vote, or raise questions, that audience can be created right now. I think people are looking for something. Look, you have these nuts, the populist nuts. Many of them are dangerous. You know them. They can be dangerous because they're so simple-minded. They want simple-minded solutions for everything. They want to know who to kill, who to shoot. They don't want to know how to construct a solution. They want to know how to shoot somebody or how to find a contract and enforce it. But there's a great disquietude and distrust of everything in this nation. And if we can bring something positive, there's some people who are out there trying to feed distrust into hate. And the rest of us are trying to feed the distrust into something positive by providing an alternative. I think this can be very useful. I don't think it's the whole answer, but I always take if someone in the crowd stands up on their hind legs, somebody else is likely to do so too. So I don't think this will be wasted. I think many people on the Hill and in politics will pay attention to what is going on here today and tomorrow. I don't think that's an impossible task. Winning is another matter. We can, as the lawyer says, we can present the case, but then you got to go on and win it. I think it's a winnable case, but I think we can have the opportunity to present it. From there on, we're on our own.
Anyone?
Mr. Chair,
Yeah, Mr. Ferguson.
if I may, excuse me, and I do apologize for being overbearing, I guess, to some extent, but Mr. LaRouche made a comment earlier which I wanted to just comment upon, and again, I'm Ferguson from South Carolina, and like Mr. LaRouche, I spent what I consider to be a good deal of time in a facility with these drug pushers, allegedly, and perpetrators, but him obviously being a man of economics, I certainly expect and am sure that he does realize that one of the reasons these people, the prisons are full of these types of people, is something above and beyond race. And one of the reasons that he, as an accomplished white man in the United States, has suffered the wrongdoings that have been perpetrated upon him is because T. Ferguson and Lyndon LaRouche and other people have become desensitized by us watching these drug pushers being herded into this country's prisons by the hundreds and sometimes the thousands. And I would also hope that we do keep in mind that these people are not there solely because of them supposedly having violated the law. I take the position that this country does not give one damn about Negroes overdosing on drugs, but this country's power structure does care very much about the hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars that these oftentimes uneducated people have at their disposal. And money in America denotes power. So I submit that it may very well be that in order for people like Mr. LaRouche to ultimately get the relief that he's seeking and that I'm seeking and the other people here assembled are seeking, we may very well have to take more and better notice of these people in jail for drugs, serving long prison sentences for what oftentimes amount to minor crimes in the overall scheme of things. And if you look back even, he's clearly a man of letters. I think the United States is in a very similar situation as was Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution, when the Bolsheviks ate from trash cans and herded in their masses on the streets, while the Tsar and his crowd, just a few floors above, lived in pure decadence. And I think ultimately that is what will happen in America, because I submit that whites in America having the direct contact with Great Britain, most whites, and I do not say this disrespectfully, I think it's a fair and a hopefully objective observation. I think most white Americans live, at least in a mindset of a structured environment, a class system. We as African Americans tend to be socialistic in mindset, at least. So I hope that as we go forward from these hearings, both the whites and the blacks involved will keep in mind our differences as well as those things that we have in common, and try to structure things such that we can put our best foot forward when we try to go to Congress and try to get these things heard. And I do apologize, but I hope that all efforts toward making this a better product are welcome. I'm satisfied they are. And I thank you again.
Thank you. Any comment, Mr. LaRouche?
I just say that the problem here, I think, is indifference. Just an anecdote I've told many times, but I think it's relevant. When I left India to return to the United States at the end of the war, I would say that a majority of the soldiers with me coming back agreed on justice for developing nations, as we'd call them today. Agreed that what was going on, what we'd seen, couldn't go on. It was contrary to the interests of the United States. I met many of these people who'd been fellow soldiers in the few years following the war, looking up old buddies, or so to speak. And their opinion had changed. They were so afraid of the Depression, which they were convinced the 1946-48 circumstances had brought upon them, that they were prepared to sell their souls for the sake of family security. And when the so-called McCarthyism period came along, they were willing to lie or turn anybody in and do anything to have family security. Now, these were the people who, in the late 50s and 60s, would support civil rights, because they had come out of their hidey holes in their different circumstance and were the people that Kennedy and Johnson would rely upon as a base for the civil rights cause, the Civil Rights Bill. But then they changed again. What they did is they lost their morality by retreating into personal concerns and not wanting to know about anything which might take something away from them or threaten their security. That tradition, as I saw in teaching on campuses between 66 and 73, where I met the baby boomers, the children of my generation, my returning wartime generation. I saw some bright kids, but I also saw the taint of their parents' immoral cowardice during the post-war period reflected in them. Their capacity for commitment was limited. They were labeled. They would change from one moment to the other, like a jackrabbit who couldn't, decide which direction he's going to go in. The problem we face today, I think, the susceptibility to cruelty. And I saw African Americans in prison. I saw what's done to them. I worked with them. I know what was going on. It's destruction, pure destruction. When these people get out of prison, it's a wonder that any of them has any capacity to survive. Everything is taken away from them. They're being destroyed. 2 years in prison, they've lost their wife. They've lost their family. 15 years from now, the children will probably be in some criminal trouble. The wife may get into criminal trouble. The whole community is tainted. Whole communities in this country are tainted by this process, which the brother referred to. But the problem today, what makes the American races today, is not race hatred as such. It's something deeper and more original. It's me. Concern for themselves and willing to throw the other guy in the lifeboat overboard to survive. And they just want an excuse to make it easy to pick out who goes overboard. It's in moral indifference. And there's no cure for this except the one the New Testament provides. Agape, love. If you can inspire people to begin to care and to hope, you can get them to shirk this indifference. And the worst racism, in my experience, is not the guy who was raised with a red neck and a wool hat. The worst racist, remember the Ku Klux Klan, when it recruited under Woodrow Wilson, who was one of the leaders of the recruiting of the Klan, it was recruited largely in places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio, and so forth, Illinois. So it wasn't rednecks. What was created was indifference was turned into scapegoating of your fellow man. Find somebody to club, find somebody to hate, find a prisoner to execute, find an immigrant to throw out of the country, find a scapegoat. And then some clever swine comes along and says, why don't you pick him for a scapegoat? And out of pure middle-class piggish indifference, you've turned a liberal into a racist. And that's our problem.
Let me just make one other observation, and I'd love to get your comment on this. Mrs. Robertson there, as you know, and I did know Martin Luther King, and about a month before Mrs. Robinson and them went across that bridge in Selma and changed the world. A delegation of about 7 people, including King, went to visit the president, Mr. Johnson, to ask him to present to the Congress a voting rights bill. And Mr. Johnson said, boys, I just gave you a civil rights bill last year. You can go to the Holiday Inn. Now you can go anywhere I want to go. The country won't stand for 2 civil rights bills in a row. Said, go back home, be quiet. Quiet down. Of course, they didn't. And Mrs. Robinson then went back and went across that bridge. And there was Lyndon Johnson watching all that on the television. And a few days later, there he was before joint session of Congress, presenting what became the 1965 Civil Rights Statute. And he ended, if you remember, he ended that speech with, "We shall overcome." Martin King later told me that he and his wife were watching that on television. And when Lyndon Johnson said that, a little tear rolled down his cheek. And I said to him, well, the little tear rolled down mine, but for different reasons. It may well be that you are no longer the #1 civil rights leader in America. Lyndon is. The same man who 30 days ago said, go back home and be quiet. I just think that racism in America is so much a part of the fabric, so much a part of the history, that it clouds everything. And I don't know how we can honestly even address the very serious concerns that you have and the rest of us have, unless we first try to find some way to grapple directly with this filth that's in the hearts of so many Americans. I'll say this, and I'll hush, and I just want to hear your comment about it.
I think what you say is true. I think that nothing can cure that problem except redemption. This is not one of the things that can ebb away easily. It's there. Because people in America still today do not believe that when they look behind the eyes of a human being, there's something there which is divine, a potential for creative reason. And that is the distinction between man and animal. That people in the United States today tend to be persuaded that their lusts, their appetites, their greed, their pleasure, their personal pain are everything. And everything is physical. And therefore they say, well, if you've got a physical difference, that makes your personality. Because they don't see, when they don't believe in education, when they don't see a baby and say that baby is going to have a classical humanist education to bring out the human divine potential in that little mind, when they say, well, that baby belongs to this race and therefore he shouldn't have that education because he's not going to have that kind of job. He should have a second-grade education or a third-grade education. That when you have a nation that does not see behind the eyes of another human being an essentially beautiful principle which is divine, which partakes of the nature of God, the power of creative reason, you're going to have racism. And therefore, only a nation which gets down on its knees, in a sense, and says, we were about to be destroyed. You think Job had troubles? We've got some real stuff here. And when a nation senses that, how close they are to destruction, and demand redemption, I think that's the only thing that's going to cure them. I don't think anything else will cure it. We can cure it with education over generations, but to cure it now with this nation is an act of redemption. And I think that's what we need.
We want to give Helga Zepp-LaRouche the opportunity to comment. If you'll please come up, we won't run him off necessarily. Some of you perhaps do not know of the remarkable efforts that have been made by Helga LaRouche to support her husband and to be an effective force in the continent of Europe and the continent of America for what we believe. Helga?
Thank you. I just would like to speak to the need to succeed in our efforts. I do not think it's enough to just present the case. I think it is vital for history that we win. My life has been definitely marked and changed by the injustice which hit us, and I'm in the business of fighting to undo it really since 1987, when the first indictments against my husband came. He was called a criminal, a fraud person, and similar things. And I was so upset about this that I decided that the most beautiful human being I know on this planet, who has devoted his entire life to undo the injustice globally, could not be slandered. So I organized, together with my associates in Europe, in Paris, the first conference of this human rights effort to put the character of Mr. LaRouche on the right footing. And I got people of different fields who he had touched through his work to testify if this man is capable of what he is being accused. So we got a German military person, we got one of the, if not the leading musician of the Amadeus Quartet. We got other people from science, from culture, who all testified to his character. And at that point, it was an uphill battle, because as it was mentioned several times, once the media decides to go for character assassination and doing it globally as it was done, a lot of minds are poisoned, and a lot of people believe what is being disseminated as slanders. Now, when Lynn was put in prison, we kept mobilizing the entire time to free him, because it was very clear that giving him the sentence of 15 years was meant to be a death sentence, and that he was not supposed to come alive out of prison. Now, we did lobbying. We had altogether, I would say, 800 elected officials around the world, about 3,000 VIPs, among them former heads of government, who eventually all lobbied for him, wrote letters to President Clinton, to the different committees in the Senate. And I want to report to you a transformation process, because in the beginning, those members of Congress in the Black Caucus, in the other caucuses, they would somehow listen, but they would have mixed minds. And when we finally succeeded to get Lynn free about 1.5 years ago, we kept this effort going and said that we need the full exoneration, because Lynn's name must be cleared so that he can do the political task he has to do. And the recent experience with these activities, and we had people from the Duma in Russia, from the Ukrainian parliament, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America, we have found that the Congress, there is not one person anymore who does not privately agree that this is a completely political case and that this is the biggest frame-up. And we had several congressmen who said, yes, I would do it, but give me one other congressman, and then we do it together. Or people saying, you're absolutely right, but we need a little bit more courage here. So the reason why I'm saying it is that it's not the beginning, and in a certain sense, people know, that if we don't change this now with the Frühmenschen operation, everything the civil rights movement had accomplished will be undone and made worse. Because, just having come back from Alabama, I was totally shocked to see this state, which really is a nightmare. And I mean, the people who have to live there and have no hope to improve their life or that of their children are really condemned to a more horrible situation than any third world country. And I have been in several. So I want to point to one other aspect for your consideration of why we must win. The most important in history is ideas, especially those ideas which move mankind forward, which are ideas which make the life of generations to come more human. And you can see it in those states which are governed by racism, like I saw it just in Alabama, where I thought Selma would be full of monuments for Martin Luther King, and I mean I was really totally shocked to see that the opposite was true. You see, when the absence of ideas is the case, like the absence of civil rights, the absence of human rights, how much misery that does to the people. So, for me, the biggest crime, what happened to my husband, is not that he was innocently in jail. And, I'm not saying it was not a hard time, because it was. And, I can only say that, people should feel the heart pain of what also Patricia Morris expressed, that, this is done to real human beings. It's not just some figures and statistics. People suffer. Their whole lives are being destroyed. But the lack of the ability to have important ideas govern history, that is the biggest crime. And Lynn, while he was incredibly courageous of producing creative work when he was in prison, he did more in prison than any of us outside, and he put us to shame. But nevertheless, I will only give you one example. In 1989, he was already in jail for nearly 1 year when the borders of Europe opened. He, from his prison cell, designed a great vision how to integrate Eastern Europe, Western Europe, China, the whole Eurasian continent, which would have been a groundbreaking conception which would have put the entire history of the 20th century on a totally new basis. Because economically, to integrate that economic space as one, would have given opportunities and freedom to the states of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the Asian countries. And he designed such a plan, which we presented, and which now, in the meantime, is practically as an alternative on the table in Russia, in Ukraine, in the European Union. But because Lynn was in jail, this idea did not become as effective as if he would have been free. And instead, you had Bush and Thatcher organizing the Balkans War, the Gulf War, imposing austerity conditions on Eastern Europe, with the result that Russia today is becoming a horrible place of big danger and anti-Western sentiment, which potentially could lead to World War III down the road. Now, I'm saying this because, to put a man of great ideas into jail is a crime all by itself because of the ideas. The reason why we were able to mobilize hundreds of parliamentarians and thousands of VIPs from around the globe, why would people from Africa sign the parole request for Lyndon LaRouche? Why would people from Latin America do this? Why would people from around the world, from Russia, why would people come out of completely different cultural worlds to fight for this man? Well, because we not only said this man must be free and his innocence must be proven, but many of them told me and others that they understand that the kind of change in global policy my husband is standing for, the kind of just new world economic order which allows the economic development of Africa, which allows the economic development of the developing countries of Eastern Europe, they say is the only hope for them, for their nation, as far away as it may be. So the reason why we must win is not because it's a personal affair. But as my husband was saying, we are going into a period of crisis which most people are completely unaware of. The kinds of changes have to be big, and they have to be done with the help of the United States, because the world cannot be saved against the United States. If you have a fascist president in the United States from '96 onward, my hopes that the rest of the world will make it are very slim. So it is a historical necessity, and I think that in a certain sense, given the experience I have from 8 years of fighting this, given the fact that more and more people around the globe are united around this and understand that mankind is really sitting in one boat this time, that either we solve all our problems at once or nobody will live, I think we can win, and I think we must have that attitude.
Thank you so much. The session is over. We will gather tomorrow morning at least by 9:15 so that we can start promptly at 9:30. And thank all of you for attending today.